The clash of shields, shouts, the clang of swords, and sudden silence. Only the thud of hooves on wet ground and the gasps of the last living. This was the sound of Europe's fear in the 9th century. City after city, monastery after monastery, everything situated near water became prey for the people who came from the north. Why did these warriors never take prisoners? Why did their name make entire kingdoms tremble? The answer lies not only in their cruelty, but also in their faith, where death on the battlefield was considered a reward, and mercy a disgrace. But before the northern shores turned into a forge of terror, there was a land where cold and hardship tempered people stronger than steel. Archaeological excavations in Birka and Hedeby show that Viking life was harsh. The land was stony, harvests were meager, and hunger was a frequent visitor during long winters. Their villages stood on the border between survival and death. Under these conditions, a special breed of people emerged, those who did not fear death because they encountered it daily. These northern warriors lived by a principle that Latin chroniclers would later call weird fate. This was not merely a belief in predestination, but an acknowledgement. Everything is already decided, and therefore fear loses its meaning. For a person who believes in weird, captivity is not a chance for life, but a rejection of destiny. Imagine a village where every boy from childhood hears that death in battle will open for him the gates of Valhalla, the Hall of the Fallen. There, according to Scandinavian belief, warriors feast eternally and fight again under the gaze of the gods. And now try to imagine how this faith transforms a person into a weapon that cannot be stopped by fear, pain, or threat. This is why the word drakar became a symbol of fear. These long ships with carved dragon heads sped across the waves like living monsters. Their appearance on the horizon meant only one thing: doom. A drakar is more than a vessel. It is the embodiment of the northern spirit, light, flexible, deadly. Contemporaries wrote that the monks of Lindisfarne did not even have time to ring the bell when the Vikings burst into the monastery. This happened in the summer of 793, a date that historians call the beginning of the Viking Age. There were no declarations of war, no envoys, only a sudden strike. From then on, Europe understood. The enemy came not for conquest, but for devastation. They did not build castles, nor did they occupy thrones. Their goal was gold, glory, and eternal memory. To take prisoners? Why, if the gods only needed dead heroes, not enslaved shadows. But what seemed like madness had a strict order. In every warband, a law was in effect: drang. This word meant a warrior worthy of glory. To kill an enemy was an honor, to capture him, a disgrace. Every raid was a test not only of strength but also of honor, and yet, even amidst the terror of their raids, there existed a sacred code that distinguished them from mere brigands. When monks wrote about the devilish people from the north, they did not understand that behind every axe blow stood faith, discipline, and an ancient order to which everyone submitted. But this order would soon turn against them, because those who took no prisoners would one day face something that could not be killed by a sword. When the ice had not yet left the fjords, and the northern sun merely touched the mountain peaks, the Vikings were already preparing for an expedition. For them, summer began not with plowing, but with forging iron. In smoky forges, axes, swords, and spears were born. Their steel, found during excavations in upland, contains traces of a Damascus pattern, proof that Scandinavians traded even with the Middle East. Every blade was an alloy of northern cold and eastern fire. And each was personal. A Viking knew his sword by its sound, by its balance, by the color of its blade in twilight. Preparation for a raid was almost a ritual. On the shore, a drakar was built, a longship with curved planks, light and flexible like a predatory fish. One ship accommodated about 60 people. Ancient chronicles mention that in just a few weeks Vikings could launch an entire fleet. A drakkar could travel by sea and by rivers, which gave them an advantage. They could strike deep into Europe where the enemy never expected to see the sea. In these campaigns, the main thing was not the leader, but the word heerd, warband. This was not just a group of warriors, but a brotherhood bound by an oath and shared plunder. To break the heerd's oath meant to lose everything, and that is why the Vikings did not take prisoners. Any enemy outside their brotherhood was considered a being from another world. Before departure, priests offered sacrifices to the gods. Often these were animals, but sources also mention human sacrifices in particularly significant expeditions. Blood flowed over the stones into the sea, and warriors touched the altar, uttering an oath not to return without glory. From the perspective of their faith, to die in battle meant to enter the halls of Odin. To remain alive but lose meant to be banished forever. These sensory images of those days are striking. Morning fog, the smell of tar and sweat, the creak of planks underfoot. The men were silent, their faces scarred and weathered. Each knew his place, rowers on the thwarts, archers closer to the bow, the jarl in the center. His shield, painted with a raven pattern, symbolized Odin himself, the god of war and wisdom. This symbol was called Hugin and Munin, two ravens whose names meant thought and memory. They seemed to fly ahead of the army, bringing news of the enemy's fate. Interestingly, discipline in their ranks was stricter than in most European armies of that time. Excavations in Norway and Sweden showed identical sets of weapons, shields, and armor, meaning equipment was produced centrally. The weight of a helmet was about 3 kilograms, chainmail up to 10. For a fighter just over 170 centimeters tall, this was heavy. But every movement was perfected over years. Warriors trained on the plains, throwing axes at posts, practicing formations. One of the main ones was the swine, a wedge, piercing the enemy's formation. The strongest went in the center, the young on the sides. It was a living battering ram that broke enemy lines like a storm breaks fences. But their strength was not only in iron. The northern climate made them equally hardened in body and spirit. The water was icy, food simple, dried meat, oat gruel, fish. Everyone knew that weakness was a luxury one could not afford. And even in sleep, a Viking kept his weapon nearby. Waking could be the last moment of life. Modern historians note that the absence of prisoners in their campaigns was not cruelty, but strategy. A captive slows movement, demands food, creates a risk of revenge, and speed was the Vikings' main weapon. A drakkar had to be light not only in body, but also in the conscience of its crew. On deck, to the sound of a horn, the men lowered their oars into the water. Movement began, and the cold wind raised the sail. The ship glided over the waves like a shadow. All that remained behind was the fire of bonfires on the shore. All that lay ahead was wealth and death. The Vikings knew that not all would return, but those who fell would be accepted by the gods as heroes. And when the first waves broke against the bow of the drakkar, where a dragon with an open maw was carved, it became clear. Now nothing would stop their path. Europe was still asleep, but its nightmare was already moving across the sea. Night. The sea was black, like blood frozen on iron. On the horizon, neither star nor light, only the splash of oars and the quiet whistle of the wind, as if the very air feared to betray the approach of the northern shadows. Thus began the Viking raids, suddenly, without warning, like a lightning strike in a clear sky. When the first rays of the sun touched the coast, it was already too late. Strangers with axes stood at the monastery doors, and smoke rose into the sky. Historians write that the first attacks were not large, no more than 2 or 3 dozen ships, but even this was enough to paralyze kingdoms. English chronicles of the 9th century report that neither prayer nor gold could stop them. The Vikings attacked not for destruction, but for plunder and glory. They knew the value of speed and surprise. While the knights of Europe gathered armies for weeks, the northerners struck and vanished within a day. Before each landing, a battle cry rang out, Skjaldborg. This was not just a shout, but a signal to form a shield wall. Shields locked together, forming a living barrier capable of withstanding the onslaught of spears and arrows. The word itself meant shield city. This tactic was a key term of that era. It transformed a group of people into a single moving fortress. The most experienced stood in front, those who had survived dozens of battles. Behind them, the young, whose eyes had not yet grown accustomed to blood. The scene of battle was short and terrifying. Shield against shield, axe blow, scream, gasp, the smell of blood and wet earth. The Vikings wasted no time on prisoners. A dead enemy poses no threat. A living one is a burden. Moreover, in their culture there was a concept of nýðingur, a man without honor. To take an enemy captive meant to become a nýðingur oneself. For a Viking, this was worse than death. But behind this cruelty lay precise organization. Each raid had a jarl, a chieftain who was responsible for discipline and plunder. The jarl had a deputy, a hersir. He distributed the spoils and ensured that each warrior received a share. To violate the order of distribution meant to incur the wrath of the entire warband. And it was this order that allowed the Vikings to act as a single unit, even far from their homeland. Frankish monastic chronicles describe how, at the sight of Drakars, monks threw bells into rivers so they wouldn't be found. This is not a legend, but a fact confirmed by discoveries at the mouths of the Seine and Loire. Heavy bronze bells buried in the silt, a trace of panicked flight. For Europe, the sound of the Viking horn became a symbol of the end. They attacked at any time of year. In winter, when rivers froze, ships were dragged across the ice. In spring, when the water rose, they went deep into the continent. Chronicles record raids even deep within France, hundreds of kilometers from the sea. This seemed impossible, but the light Drakars traveled along narrow rivers, leaving behind only smoke and the hoofprints of laden horses. Every such campaign was a mixture of religion and strategy. Before battle, a priest threw a spear towards the enemy, a sign that the souls of the fallen belonged to Odin. This gesture was called Geir's Kast, and its symbolism was simple: to whom the spear, to him death. And when the spear struck the ground before the first enemy formation, it meant it was already too late to pray. But even more terrifying was that the Vikings were not afraid to die. Their eyes burned like those who had already seen their end. One of the Frankish chroniclers wrote, "They smiled when arrows pierced them." This faith made them invincible not in body but in spirit. For how can one defeat someone who is glad to perish? In battle, every strike had a purpose. Swords were not swung wildly, they were thrust. Axes chopped not at the head, but at the legs, unbalancing the enemy. When the enemy's formation collapsed, a slaughter began. Women and children, priests and knights. For the Vikings, all were part of a single fate. They did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, because they believed, if the gods decided that you would meet a warrior from the north, then your hour had come. Yet it was not only fear that drove them forward. Every campaign was a chance to become a legend, for glory, according to their belief, is the only thing that outlives death. In saga songs it was said, "A name lives longer than the body." Therefore, they fought not for life, but for a name. The sun rises over the coast, and smoke still hangs over the burned houses. On the sand are footprints of bare feet and blood-stained shields. The Drakars depart into the sea, light, as if the waves themselves carry them away. On the shore, silence. Europe would again live in anticipation of the next storm, for everyone knew, somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, new shadows were already preparing. By the mid-9th century, the fear of Vikings reached its limit. Frankish chronicles called them the Plague of the North, and English monks wrote that The sea casts forth demons. But behind this horror lay astonishing precision of action. The Vikings learned not merely to attack, they transformed plunder into a system. Their raids became operations where every detail mattered. The most terrible of such strikes was the campaign against Paris in 857. 200 ships ascended the Seine, as if the river itself had opened the way for them. Contemporaries recalled that the sound of oars and sails resembled a storm. Aboard each vessel, about 60 men, meaning almost 12,000 warriors, approached the city walls. They advanced not with insane fury, but with the cold-blooded determination of artisans of war. Paris was not ready. The city was surrounded by walls, but its defense consisted of 102 warriors and monks with crosses. The Vikings camped on the Ile de la Cité, where Notre Dame Cathedral stands today. Their camp was a precise mirror of military organization: tents in rows, weapon depots, forges under awnings. Archaeological data confirm the presence of traces of forge pits and charcoal stains at this site. This meant the Northerners truly lived here for weeks. Before the assault, Jarl Ragnar, whose name became legendary, ordered a wall of ships to be built to block the current. This was a tactic called skippaborg, a ship fortress. It allowed for the creation of a floating fortification from which shelling could be conducted. No army in Europe at that time possessed such a tactic. The assault began to the blare of horns. The Vikings used flaming arrows and tar to weaken the wooden gates. When smoke obscured the sky, they advanced in a swine formation, a wedge breaking through the defenders. The first ranks fell, but the rest marched over the bodies. Contemporaries wrote that the earth trembled from their tread, and again, no prisoners, only bodies and ashes. The reason for this ran deeper than mere cruelty. For the Vikings, battle was a sacred exchange, life for glory. Captivity disrupted this balance, for he who did not die could not complete his journey. Therefore, after battle, the bodies of enemies were burned or thrown into the water to prevent their souls from returning. This ritual was called blot, a sacrifice. But sacrifices were offered not to the gods for mercy, but to the world for balance. Paris did not fall completely, but the ransom paid by the Franks was unprecedented: 7,000 pounds of silver. This amounted to about 2 tons of precious metal. With this money, a city could have been built, but the Franks preferred to pay just so the Northerners would leave, and the Vikings left, only to return again. Their victories had another side. Along with plunder, they brought home not only gold, but also knowledge. Archaeological finds in Uppsala and Riga show artifacts from the Frankish state, England, and even Byzantium. This means that raids transformed into a cultural exchange through blood and fire. With each passing year, their fleets grew. By the end of the 9th century, raids were already turning into entire armies. But even with thousands of warriors, one principle remained: not to take prisoners. Because every campaign was not just plunder, but a sacred ordeal. There was no place for the weak in it. The Franks tried to adapt. They built stone fortresses, established coastal guards, introduced taxes for ransoming prisoners. But what to do if the enemy takes no prisoners at all? If your life holds no value for him? The Viking tactics broke the very logic of warfare in Europe at that time. The culmination of this fear was the so-called Great Heathen Army campaign of 865. Tens of thousands of warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden advanced on England. They were united not by a kingdom, but by an idea: to conquer a land where one could die with honor. Chronicles refer to this army as the Great Heathen Army. Their eyes burned like those who had already seen their end. One of the Frankish chroniclers wrote, "They smiled when arrows pierced them." This faith made them invincible, not in body, but in spirit. For how can one defeat someone who is glad to perish? In battle, every strike had a purpose. Swords were not swung wildly, they were thrust. Axes chopped not at the head but at the legs, unbalancing the enemy. When the enemy's formation collapsed, a slaughter began. Women and children, priests and knights, for the Vikings all were part of a single fate. They did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, because they believed if the gods decided that you would meet a warrior from the north, then your hour had come. Yet it was not only fear that drove them forward. Every campaign was a chance to become a legend, for glory, according to their belief, is the only thing that outlives death. In saga songs it was said, "A name lives longer than the body." Therefore they fought not for life, but for a name. The sun rises over the coast, and smoke still hangs over the burned houses. On the sand are footprints of bare feet and blood-stained shields. The Drakars depart into the sea, light as if the waves themselves carry them away. On the shore, silence. Europe would again live in anticipation of the next storm, for everyone knew, somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, new shadows were already preparing. By the mid-9th century, the fear of Vikings reached its limit. Frankish chronicles called them the Plague of the North, and English monks wrote that the sea casts forth demons. But behind this horror lay astonishing precision of action. The Vikings learned not merely to attack, they transformed plunder into a system. Their raids became operations where every detail mattered. The most terrible of such strikes was the campaign against Paris in 857. 200 ships ascended the Seine, as if the river itself had opened the way for them. Contemporaries recalled that the sound of oars and sails resembled a storm. Aboard each vessel, about 60 men, meaning almost 12,000 warriors, approached the city walls. They advanced not with insane fury, but with the cold-blooded determination of artisans of war. Paris was not ready. The city was surrounded by walls, but its defense consisted of 100 or 2 warriors and monks with crosses. The Vikings camped on the Ile de la Cité, where Notre Dame Cathedral stands today. Their camp was a precise mirror of military organization: tents in rows, weapon depots, forges under awnings. Archaeological data confirm the presence of traces of forge pits and charcoal stains at this site. This meant the Northerners truly lived here for weeks. But even in this law, their old cruel logic lived on. Honor was more important than life. Captivity, worse than death. The Northerners began to accept Christianity, but not immediately and reluctantly. The first crosses on their ships were not a symbol of faith, but a sign of political compromise. However, when faith changed them, it could not erase memory. Even after becoming kings, the descendants of the Vikings remembered. Their ancestors did not take prisoners, because they did not recognize spiritual slavery. In Normandy, where the Vikings settled under the leadership of Rollo, a new principality emerged. Frankish chronicles recount how Emperor Charles the Simple granted him land in exchange for an oath of peace. But chroniclers note that Rollo refused to kiss the emperor's hand. Instead, he made one of his warriors bow down and put the emperor's hand to his lips, a symbol of pride that neither power nor religion could break. In the north, Vikings became merchants. Their ships now carried not warriors, but furs, amber, and silver. But even trade remained a continuation of war. Now it was a struggle for influence. A new theme resonates in runes and sagas: conquest by wealth. And yet, despite soft sails and the jingle of coins, behind all this stood the same force that once led them to the shores of England. Interestingly, archaeologists, upon excavating Viking graves, often find weapons placed next to the body, even if the person died a natural death. This means that the image of the warrior remained eternal. Even when the wars ended, they believed that a battle awaited them beyond the threshold. Historians debate when the Viking Age ended. Some name the year 1005 when King Olaf Tryggvason baptized Norway. Others the year 1042, the death of the last king Canute the Great. But perhaps it never ended at all, because the spirit of a Viking is not a sword and not a ship. It is a state of mind, a refusal of submission. Europe changed under their blows. Coasts were fortified. Armies learned to act faster. Cities to build stronger. Even the concept of speed of war was born then, when dracars sped along rivers. The Vikings taught Europe to fear, and thereby made it stronger. However, in this new Europe, they themselves became a part of it. Their descendants sat on the thrones of England, ruled Normandy, fought in Byzantium. They were no longer the plague of the North. They became its memory, but a memory in which iron still clangs and the roar of the sea wind is heard. And yet the question remained. If faith in Valhalla and disdain for captivity made them invincible, then what happened when this faith disappeared? What became of the people who considered death a gift and life a test? The answer lies at the very heart of this legend, where something eternal is born between blood and glory. When the temples of Odin were replaced by churches and dracars rotted in harbors, Europe breathed a sigh of relief. But the silence, which came after centuries of thunder, did not mean oblivion. The memory of the Vikings lived in stones, in songs, in the blood of those who no longer knew how to fear. Their spirit dissolved into the very idea of Europe, to not submit to circumstances, to go where others dared not. Modern archaeologists found swords bent in half before burial in northern cemeteries. This was done not out of superstition. The blade was broken so that no one could wield it after death, a symbol of farewell to war, but also a sign that even in death, a warrior yielded to no one. And perhaps that is precisely why the Vikings never took prisoners. For them, freedom was not a reward, but a duty. Captivity was oblivion, and oblivion was worse than death. Their axes fell silent centuries ago, but the meaning of their faith resonates even today. To live in such a way that even an enemy remembers your name. And now, knowing their history, one can only ask oneself, could you look fate in the eye just as they did, without fear, without hope for mercy? Could you go into battle where death is not the end, but proof that you lived truly? Because perhaps the most terrifying thing about the Vikings was not that they killed, but that they were not afraid to live.